Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. We're pleased to have with us Siddharth Varadarajan, a guest speaker for the Jeremiah Lecture Series brought to campus by the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies. Siddharth Varadarajan is an author and a journalist. He is the deputy editor of The Hindu, India's leading English language newspaper. His writing has been sharply critical of, among other things, United States policies regarding nuclear proliferation and its attempts to establish a new balance of power in Asia. He earned his Bachelor and Master of Science degrees at the London School of Economics. He then studied at Columbia University as a doctoral candidate and taught at New York University before leaving academia for a career in journalism. Before joining The Hindu, he freelanced for Frontline and reported for the Times of India. He is the editor of the book Gujarat, The Making of a Tragedy. His book, Hegemony Outsourced, The United States, India, and the Struggle for Asia, is forthcoming. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule and being with us here.
Thank you.
In Eugene.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start by discussing the sort of change that's going on now in the let's say balance of power in the world, particularly in India and China. So what do you see as the most significant changes in your own country in relationship to what seems to be a shift in the balance of world power at the moment?
I think the big story in my part of the world really is the rising economic footprint of both India and China. China, in a sense, is 10 years ahead of India. They've had higher and more sustained rates of growth going back for perhaps a decade and a half. India's growth story is more recent. But I think if current trends continue, then we are looking in the next 10 or 15 years at India and China together accounting for perhaps as much as 30 to 35% of world GDP. And you cannot have such an outcome without these two countries also playing a very big role in the reconfiguration of international politics and the international order. And I think that's really what's happening. The rise of India and China, which is also often described as the rise of Asia, is essentially forcing the world to re-examine the basis of international cooperation and international politics. And I think that's essentially why the United States has begun to reach out to India, not so much to help contain China, but certainly to help negotiate its way better through the implications that a rising China will have.
Now tell me, this is maybe not your field, but it seems like since this is such a dramatic change that's happening in the world, I don't think this was even, say, a campaign issue in the presidential elections of the United States, that is policy towards India and China, either in 2004 or in 2000. It seems to have something that's sort of been recognized, but not really discussed in a democratic way in the United States. Is that your sense of the situation?
Very much so. I think neither China nor India figures as an explicit agenda item in domestic politics in the United States. At least that's my understanding of it. But I think in a way that's also because what kind of relationship the US should have with India and China, I think there's a broad consensus about it. And the consensus is the following. I think both wings of the American domestic political spectrum are united, broadly speaking, in recognizing the challenge, if you want to be polite, or the threat, if you want to be rude, that China poses to the US in the long term. And similarly, I think both the Democrats and the Republicans are united in the idea that better relations with India, particularly in the strategic, military and economic field, will help the United States negotiate its way through some of these dramatic changes that are happening. So I think that may perhaps be one explanation for why it's not a campaign issue. It's not something in which I suspect the Republicans and the Democrats differ all that much. And we could see it earlier, last year, when the US-India civil nuclear deal was put to vote in Congress. There was broad bipartisan support in both houses of Congress for a proposal that, when it was first unveiled, was certainly seen as something highly controversial. But when it finally came down to it, both Democrats and Republicans seem to have united behind this measure, which represents a significant opening up by the United States towards India.
But again, it seems to me, perhaps, yes, at the congressional level that was the case, but don't you think this should have been, well, it's not for you, I guess, to say. You're not a citizen, are you, of the United States? Oh, you are. You are. I see.
I'm not a lapsed citizen, but a citizen. I was born in the U.S.
Yes, I know that, yeah.
And through a complicated set of circumstances.
Do you have dual citizenship then?
No, I don't have dual because India doesn't allow it.
I see.
But I have an American passport through a story that's too complicated to narrate.
I see.
And I'm sort of in the process of converting my citizenship back to Indian. But since I live and work in India,
right.
You will accept that my engagement with American politics is rather marginal.
But don't you think it's the kind of thing, yes, I mean, people agreed, but there was a lot of, even after it was signed, there was a lot of disagreement as to whether this is a good thing in terms of the implications for nuclear proliferation in the world as a whole. So in a sense, it was never debated. It was almost like a backdoor sort of deal by people who were already elected, rather than subjecting it to kind of a public conversation. Again, I don't know if this is your sense of it.
No, I think you're right. I think a lot of the criticism in the United, I mean, this is a deal people don't appreciate enough that has its critics in both the United States as well as in India. In India, you have people in many ways more strongly opposed to it, but precisely because they see the deal as an attempt by the United States to embroil India in a wider geopolitical strategy, which may not necessarily be in India's wider interest. So that's where people in India who are critical of the deal are coming from.
What percentage? I mean,
it's again hard to say, because ultimately debates on nuclear matters is such a rarefied, I mean, the number of people who take part in these debates is very small. But I suspect that if you look at public sentiment, there is a large percentage of the Indian population is wary of U.S. foreign policy and the implications of U.S. foreign policy in the Asian region, and hence would be wary of the Indian government getting into bed with the U.S., which is what in many ways this deal symbolizes. In the U.S., I think, as I said, there's broad agreement that the United States needs to have India on its side to deal with the emerging strategic equations in Asia. The only division is whether you need to offer India civil nuclear cooperation or not in order to achieve that. By and large, as I said, if the congressional vote is any indication, it does seem as if there is a broad bipartisan consensus for whatever reason.
Right.
But I think that has a lot to do with the fear of China, because I think it's impossible to understand the U.S. relationship with India without taking into account what the United States is doing or not doing with China. And it's this triangular relationship which is really propelling most of these developments that we see. And that's incidentally also why in India people are wary, because I don't think Indians look at China in quite as negative a manner as many people in the American political spectrum would do.
So what is the relation now between India and China?
It's a complex relationship because we have cultural, historical ties going back 3,000 years. Throughout these 3,000 years, we fought a war only once, which was in 1962, a limited border war, for which most Indians blame the Chinese, most Chinese blame the Indians. And that war led to a period of about 25 or 30 years when India and China didn't do a great deal with each other at all. Starting in the late 80s, there's been an opening up, which in a sense is linked to the greater opening of the Chinese economy and the Indian economy. And today, China is fast emerging as India's largest trading partner. I suspect in about 4 years' time, China will supplant the United States and the European Union as India's biggest trading partner. And I think this is significant because this implies the growth of a certain degree of political confidence and trust between the two countries. I think India and China, despite the pressure on both of us to see each other as rivals, particularly, for example, when it comes to competing for energy sources, have begun to explore ways in which we can both cooperate, even in the field of energy. So, for example, we spent 3 or 4 years, Chinese and Indian companies, competing head-to-head for the purchase of energy assets in third countries before both sides realized that, look, the only people who benefit from our competition are the guys who are selling these assets, who end up making a couple of $1 billion extra. So for the past 2 years, India and China have figured out how to make joint bids. And this is really the direction in which the relationship is going. It's, there are elements of competition, but I think the elements of cooperation, the areas of cooperation are also growing.
Is India, as a democracy, is India concerned about the political repression in China? And is there any idea of putting pressure in some way in terms of the economic relationship towards moving China more in the direction of a democracy?
My short answer is no, absolutely not. The Indian government takes a very conservative, a traditional view in international relations parlance of the role of trade and the role of diplomacy when it comes to dealing with matters that are quote-unquote internal to a country's affairs. I think the Indian government is aware of the vast difference in approach towards democracy in both China and India. But it does not see that as an obstacle in the development of the relationship. And China and India pioneered an approach in the 50s in Asia, which was called Panchsheel, or the Five Principles, which essentially placed at the center stage the principles of non-interference in each other's internal affairs, non-use of force. So in other words, the international relations theory that both of us subscribe to regard this as a no-no area. We do not want to get into discussions on the internal human rights situation in China or Myanmar or any other country, incidentally. India is a reluctant, even though George W. Bush has tried to get India involved in his concert of democracies idea and so on and so forth, but India remains a very reluctant recruit. Not that we do not consider democracy to be the best form of government, we do, and we're very happy that we are democratic. But we're not sure that democracy is a commodity that can be exported. Certainly there are a number of disastrous examples of where attempts have been made to export this, and the results are plain to see. So I don't think India would want to complicate its relationship with China by raising these sorts of issues.
Did you see this boom coming in India? I mean, did people see this coming? I mean, you talked about how China has a decade or so of a head start on India as a booming Asian economic power. And so did you see it coming, and how would you describe it to people?
The economic boom in India?
Exactly.
I think it's something that not many people anticipated, quite frankly. I certainly didn't. And I still am a little bit skeptical about its sustainability because unlike China, which came to its present growth model on the basis of 40 years of a relatively egalitarian system in which people's basic needs as far as health and education were taken care of. So there was a kind of a human resource base which China's economic model based on inequality has been able to, in a sense, build upon. In India, we are coming to our current economic phase of liberalization and reform without any of that. So we come to this model with vast pre-existing inequalities in access to education and healthcare. And I do not see the reform process making as deep and as fast an impact on the living conditions of the majority of Indians as one would like there to be. And I think as long as the government of India does not pay sufficient attention towards bringing the majority of people into the sphere of meaningful economic activity, I think if that's delayed or postponed, this is going to act as a drag. At the same time, the size of the economy is such. I mean, even with a model of development that's primarily based on a middle class and which excludes 500 million people, you still have an economy that's based on 300 or 400 million people, which is bigger than the size of the U.S. economy.
Right.
So I think even though it's an isolated or islanded kind of growth model, but the numbers involved are so huge that it has taken on a kind of self-sustaining character. And one can only hope that India's democratic political process will impel the government towards adopting measures and policies that will more radically attack the basis of poverty and inequality in India. So I think the sustainability of the model depends very much on that. But certainly I could not have anticipated 5 or 10 years ago that India would be such a big economic story as it is today.
And what is the reason? What are the reasons that it has exploded so
I think
so much?
I think there are 2 or 3 reasons, and it's important to recognize these so that one doesn't misread or misinterpret the model. I think India came to its current state of an economic boom primarily because it spent 4 or 5 decades engaging in very heavy public investments in infrastructure. So even though today India's infrastructure is crumbling, but for the last 40 or 50 years, because of sustained public investment and the creation of a public sector in steel, in coal mining, in transportation, in virtually every area of heavy industry, India was able to build up a certain critical mass. And that came because of public intervention and public investment. Secondly, I think India invested quite heavily in a public education system. Certainly, even if it had inadequacies at the primary education level, at the higher education level, in terms of, for example, we have Indian Institutes of Technology, first-rate medical education. So this has allowed India to generate a pool of manpower or labor power that is very skilled and very competitive at the international level. And I think, thirdly, we have been very careful in calibrating our opening up. So if you recall the Asian economic crisis of the 90s, when, because many of these countries that had opened up in the 60s and 70s had committed the mistake of having capital account convertibility. So their currencies were convertible on the capital and not just the trade account. So when the financial crisis broke in the 90s, there was a devastating run on the currencies of all of these countries. Capital fled like nothing on earth. And Korea, Indonesia, Thailand suffered a major economic collapse. India has avoided that pitfall. So even today, despite having accumulated reserves that are massive, nearly $200 billion worth of foreign currency reserves, India is resisting pressure from the United States and from some other sectors, some other countries that want India to liberalize its financial sector completely, because there's a fear that if we do that, everything that we have achieved in the past decade can easily be frittered away. So I think these ingredients, which are specific to the Indian model, which in a sense represent a calibrated liberalization, need to be appreciated.
What about outsourcing? I mean, does this have to do with the first item you mentioned? That is, you have a lot of educated people. You know, you talk to them on the phone all the time who do the outsourcing. What about outsourcing?
You know, I'm skeptical on outsourcing in the sense that I think outsourcing probably has a bigger impact on the U.S. labor market because it displaces people's jobs here, I suppose. Although there's one argument that the greater competitiveness that American companies are able to take on board as a result of using Indian labor in the long term allows them to, create more jobs in the United States. I'm not entering that debate for the moment, but I think in India, the contribution of outsourcing to our quote-unquote economic miracle is rather limited.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the number of people who work in outsourced industries, business BPOs or the telemarketing and so on, the numbers have grown dramatically, but they are quite insignificant if you consider the overall size of India's labor pool and the other areas where the economy has boomed. And so in that sense, outsourcing is a bigger story in the US than in India. I don't want to downplay at the same time the important contribution that outsourcing makes towards certainly Indian urban life and the kind of job that a young person with minimal training but language skills can get and can make reasonable money. But it's not enough really to sustain the Indian economy on its current path. There's a lot more happening than outsourcing.
I'd like to return to a topic that you raised earlier, that is the issue of poverty in India. How seriously is that being addressed by the major political parties? What sort of vision is there for the future? Because you just mentioned that the economy is booming while leaving out, did you say 500 million?
Easily, and by a conservative estimate.
Roughly 500 million people. And so, I mean, are there people working very hard to change that situation in India? I know it's of long standing.
Well, the unfortunate answer is that it's not at all much of a government priority. This is really bad news because if you look at data, there was recently the results of a major family health survey data that came out, which suggested that despite 6 or 7 years of growth at 7-8%, the percentage of Indian children who are undernourished, or who have a low body weight, or who have low height relative to their age, has not really come down. So in other words, in terms of the anthropometric measures of poverty, I mean, income poverty may have come down, but the anthropometric measures, which are in many ways more accurate, suggest that the burden of poverty continues to weigh very heavily on a large percentage of people in India. Because of our electoral system and our, the previous government, which was voted out of power in 2004, which was seen as quite aggressively pro-free market, they were defeated in the elections because people resented the fact that reforms were not trickling down. And the new government which was elected, which was led by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who is himself an economist, had promised what they call economic reforms with a human face. And under pressure from the left, which is a component of the government, they have adopted an employment guarantee scheme and certain other measures, but these are not been funded adequately enough. And there's a concern that unless the government puts up more money, because revenues are buoyant actually. Right now the government does not have a serious problem on the fiscal front. The government needs to spend money so that more and more people can be drawn into the sphere of the productive economy rather than being condemned to poverty. And I think that's my personal feeling is that not enough is being done, and it's unfortunately not enough of a political issue either.
You mentioned that in Indian politics there's the idea that you don't interfere in people's other countries' internal affairs.
Yes.
But if there is this devastating problem of poverty in India, do you consider that India's internal affair, or is this an obligation of other countries to somehow try to help and deal with this issue? And is it irresponsible not to not have the world community participating in this effort?
No, I think the obligation of the world community is to make sure that the rules of the international economic game are not stacked against the poor. And unfortunately, the way in which the rules have moved over the past decade and a half, since the Doha, or since even Marrakesh and the start of the WTO, there have been some benefits that poor countries have got out of the process. But in general, the international trading rules favor the rich countries. And certain changes that have been forced down the throat of the Indian government because of the WTO have had a harmful effect on poor people, has actually increased their vulnerability. So I think, yes, the international community has an obligation. I think if people are poor and remain poor in India or Mali or any other country, people in the United States or Britain should really look at the nature of the international trading system and ask, well, is it really worth, can I justify in human terms subsidizing maize farmers in the US to such a massive extent, or wheat farming in the US to such an extent that they are able to produce wheat at a lower price or cotton at a lower price than a poor farmer in India or Africa, because it's a result of that subsidy within the international system, which is protected by WTO, despite the fact that Indian industry has been made to open up its doors to foreign imports. It's those subsidies which is in a sense pushing a vast section of the farming community around the world towards poverty and immiseration.
So in other words, they're favoring certain countries' farming communities?
Yes, exactly.
To the detriment of
exactly.
others.
I mean, I was.
And who makes those choices?
Well, this is the political. I mean, this is in the United States political system. It is a taboo subject to try to put an end to cotton farming or maize farming subsidies. We've seen this difficulty in the negotiations with Brazil over ethanol. I was traveling in Mali in West Africa, which was famous for its blue cotton over the years. And today the Malian farmer produces cotton at a price that's much higher than what American cotton imports cost in his market in Bamako. And I think there's something fundamentally wrong with the international trading system if these things are allowed, and particularly if the tariff rate on an Indian export product, there's a controversy right now over Indian mango exports. When George W. Bush came to India in 2006, one of the highlights of the agreement he signed was that Indian mangoes could now be exported to the US. But now that we're negotiating the fine print, the conditions that the Bush administration is imposing are so onerous that it will essentially be impossible for any Indian mango exporter to profitably sell his mangoes in the US. So I think we really need to look at the impact that the international trading rules and the kind of domestic protection that rich country governments give to their own farming communities or industry. We have to look at the relationship between that and the persistence of poverty. I'm not denying the role of domestic policies in a country like India, but as far as international links are concerned, I think there's a need to look at these international connections as well.
But do we really have an international body that does this outside of the corporations themselves? I mean, in a sense, you have the United Nations. They don't really deal with economic issues.
No, I mean,
So it makes them sort of a kind of a dud in terms of the issues that really seem to be moving the world at the moment.
I mean, there is, notionally speaking, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is supposed to regulate some of these things, but the rules are quite flexible, and even when the United States has been taken to the WTO Appellate Division for unfair trading practices, the US tends to ignore those rulings. So, it's not clear to me to what extent the international system or international institutions can regulate this, and ultimately it's something that really, I think nobody would be more effective than the American voting public. I think the American voting public has to take a stand that we shouldn't do things in our country which will adversely impact people around the world who are already poor and who are already consuming far, far less than what we are doing.
But is anyone articulating this at the moment?
Well, you're entering an election season,
yes,
and
I don't hear it yet. I think we need some genuinely global thinking,
absolutely,
which we just haven't had.
Right.
What's your sense of this nuclear agreement, with India?
I think the nuclear agreement is something which, well, let's deconstruct it into two aspects. I think there are a series of restrictions that were imposed on India beginning in 1974, primarily because India refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the treaty which outlaws the possession of nuclear weapons. India took the stand that, well, why should we sign a treaty which discriminates between the five recognized nuclear weapon states, which is the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, and the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world agreed to that treaty. So if they don't have nuclear weapons, that's fine, that's their business. But India never accepted that treaty. So when India decided in 1998 to have nuclear weapons, it wasn't violating any law. It wasn't violating any agreement that it had signed. So we feel that the restrictions placed on India's civilian nuclear industry, nobody in India expects the world to help India make nuclear weapons. But I think the world should not unfairly block India from accessing civil nuclear cooperation. To the extent to which this deal will allow India to access nuclear cooperation, I think everybody in India welcomes it. What concerns me is the price that the United States administration is trying to extract from India in exchange for this quote-unquote favor that they're doing. And this price is manifest really in pressure on India's foreign policy. The US wants India to support American initiatives on Iran. They want us to do help to put pressure on China, and that's really where the problem comes.
Well, I'm going to put pressure on you right now and say, unfortunately, we're out of time. But it's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Siddharth Varadarajan, author, journalist, and guest lecturer for the Jeremiah Lecture Series. Thank you for watching.